This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Daniel. I am a parishioner here at the church, for those of you that don't know me, and my day job is school chaplain at the local Anglican Church. And I've got a doozy of a Hebrews passage to preach on. But let me start with this. There is something that you haven't done that you were supposed to do. There's something you haven't done that you were supposed to do. Now, I'm guessing that most, if not all of you, are currently feeling some sort of guilt right now. Some of you are possibly thinking, yes, there is, and I'm feeling so guilty. Some of you are thinking, oh my goodness, how does he know that I haven't done it yet? Now I'm feeling even more guilty. Some of you are thinking, oh, I'm sure there is, but I can't think what it is. So now I'm feeling worried and guilty. Maybe it's an email you haven't sent. Maybe it's a project or a job you're putting off, a phone call you're dreading to make. It could be any number of things. Guilt, whether specific or vague, has a way of clinging to us. It just hangs around, doesn't it? We all feel guilty at times. I had a whole lot of guilt attached to this sermon on all sorts of things. I felt guilty about not doing the passage justice because there was so much in it. In fact, I think I had about 3 sermons written or started throughout, including a great one that I started last week while Daniel was preaching on the previous bit. It involved kind of paralleling the movie Knives Out with this passage. It was brilliant. I'm going to have to save it because it didn't work. And so I was feeling guilty about not doing the passage justice. I was feeling guilty about not linking Thanksgiving Sunday with the Hebrews theme, with everything. I was feeling guilty about that. And then I was feeling guilty about not going too long because it's the AGM and I've got to keep it short. And then I was feeling guilty about the content of the passage because it goes on and on about all this old covenant stuff and about the way that sacrifices were to be offered and worship was to be done. And I struggled to get excited about that. So then I felt guilty about that. So that's what my sermon's going to be about feeling guilty. Because when I look at the old covenant stuff and I kind of think, well, I try and make it relevant to my life, and all the practicalities of it, they just don't match up. I'm not sure when the last time I've had to wave a hyssop branch around was. It just doesn't quite make sense to me. But where I'm going wrong with that, obviously, is that I'm focusing on the practicalities rather than on what the purpose of the old covenant was, and therefore what the purpose of the new covenant is. So that's what I want to think about. Because the old covenant wasn't about, other than superficially, it wasn't about the way we should construct our worship or live our lives, as much as it was about dealing with a fundamental human problem, and that is the problem of guilt. So let's unpack that. And I want to think a bit about our modern relationship with guilt. And to do that, here he is up on the screen, I want to flip back to Sigmund Freud, famed psychiatrist. Now, Freud, while he's a bit passé these days, there's a few things that have actually stuck with us. So let me give you a really potted kind of summary of a bit of it. Freud was big on conscience and guilt. He once said, conscience is guilt over selfish and aggressive behaviour. He believed that guilt is an unavoidable part of being human. There's 2 sorts of guilt, whether it's subjective guilt, that's the feelings of shame and regret that we place on ourselves, or objective guilt, the reality of falling short of some moral standard. So we have both sorts of guilt on us. Guilt follows us like a shadow. And Freud reshaped how people think about guilt. So his suggestion was that it stems from what he called the superego, the internalised voice of societal norms and authority figures. So he argued, well, it's not universal. He says it's culturally conditioned. And we kind of ran with that. And so modern society decided, well, if guilt is just a product of culture, we can redefine it or even eliminate it. And so that's how we deal with guilt, which is why we hear phrases like, live your truth, Guilt becomes something to reject or reframe, not to reconcile with the truth, but to just create your own. It's given rise to what's often called a therapeutic culture, where guilt is treated as a psychological burden to manage rather than a moral signal to address. So we've got this new way of dealing with guilt. But has it worked? Well, no, not really, because we're still stuck today in these patterns of trying to atone for our guilt, just like the Old Covenant, where their sacrifices, all the things they did were to try and make right their relationship with God and atone for their guilt. We're still trying to make ourselves right and atone for our guilt now. The forms are different, but the problem remains the same. So let me give you some examples of some modern echoes of the Old Covenant. We don't follow the rituals anymore, but our modern secular life parallels it, mirrors it in surprising ways. I've got 4. The first one is the ritual of achievement. So in ancient times, people sacrificed animals to seek God's favour. As far as I'm aware, we don't do that anymore. Today, we sacrifice in the workplace, chasing success to justify our existence. So long hours, sleepless nights and stress are our modern burnt offerings. We don't burn offerings anymore, we do burnout. And while the boss might give you a gold star for staying late, it doesn't quite cleanse your soul, does it? So there's the ritual of achievement. We try and appease our guilt by achieving as much as we can. Then there's the pursuit of social approval. Maybe this will deal with our guilt. Social media is our temple, and instead of sacrifices, we offer up curated posts, hoping for likes, shares, and validation. But much like the Old Covenant rituals, it's never quite enough. One post does really well, but the next one, not so much. Now, it's glaringly obvious when celebrities do it. In terms of social approval, if you're familiar with the work of Miley Cyrus, she's over her career. Look, she's shifted. If you're not familiar with her, don't be. It's fine. But Miley Cyrus has shifted her public persona multiple times to try and meet the kind of social approval that she needs. She's gone from, for the purists among you that do know, the early provocative and slightly questionable bangers era to a more, what some describe as a more mature and reflective style now. But the reinventions serve purely to align her with whatever cultural values are popular at the time and to address criticisms of her earlier actions. So we see celebrities do it all the time, but let's be honest, it's not just celebrities. How many of us, either some of us online, some of us not so much online, but how many of us do the equivalent of posting on social media, hoping for the likes and comments, just to reassure us that we're okay? But again, it never really satisfies, does it? We just keep coming back for more. So we've got the ritual of achievement, the pursuit of social approval, and then there's moral self-justification. Now, activism and philanthropy are good things, but they can become a way of declaring, I'm one of the good guys. A kind of modern version of offering spotless lambs to cover our guilt. And so these actions, while meaningful, often carry an unspoken hope of silencing that inner critic. Look, I'm a good person because I do this or this. But like the old sacrifices, they can't fully cleanse our conscience. Again, celebrities shine a more obvious light on this just because of the public nature of their lives. You've heard of Leonardo DiCaprio promoting environmentalism and yet facing criticism for using private jets. You've got Kim Kardashian advocating for social justice while profiting from luxury brands. It's this pattern of, in broader culture, of struggle to address guilt through outward actions. And then the last ritual we have is the cancel culture as atonement. In the Old Covenant, scapegoats carried the sin. Literally, a scapegoat would carry the sins of the people into the wilderness. Today, we have our own version, cancel culture. We project all our collective guilt about something onto one person, ostracise them, and hope it cleanses the rest of us. But this atonement only creates more division and shame. It's as if we think cancelling someone will fix everything, but all it really does is create a bigger mess. It's like trying to mop up a spill with more water. It just kind of spreads the guilt around. The writer of Hebrews calls the Old Covenant a shadow of good things to come. Hebrews chapter 10. A shadow of good things to come. Shadows point to something real, but they aren't the real thing. They take a rough shape of the real thing, but there's not the substance. The Old Covenant sacrifices couldn't erase guilt. They were temporary fixes, placeholders, pointing to something greater. In the same way, modern efforts to deal with guilt, achievement, social approval, philanthropy, cancel culture, they're all shadows. They might offer a momentary relief, but they can't address the heart of the problem. No matter how much we achieve, how perfectly we present ourselves, it's never enough to silence the inner critic. We're left stuck in the same cycle of guilt. And not only that, it doesn't silence the inner critic of subjective guilt. It does nothing to address that objective guilt that we carry as sinful human beings. And that's why Hebrews points to Jesus, the only one who breaks the cycle. And we get right from the start of the passage we heard read today, Hebrews 9:15. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he's died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. Imagine you're drowning in a sea of guilt, weighed down by your failures and shortcomings. The old covenant might toss you a life preserver, but it won't bring you to shore. Jesus doesn't just throw you a line, he dives in, lifts you up and carries you safely home. Tim Keller, in his sermon, The God Who Reconciles Sinners, explains that Jesus' sacrifice is the ultimate answer to guilt because it's both personal and complete. He doesn't just cover guilt, he removes it entirely. The blood of Christ doesn't just change your legal standing before God, it cleanses your conscience. Because through Jesus, the objective guilt is addressed. He pays the penalty for sin. He fulfills the standard we couldn't meet. Our guilt is removed. And through Jesus, our subjective guilt is lifted. His forgiveness wipes the slate clean, freeing us from shame. So this idea of atonement is more than just a religious word. It's the solution to our deepest problem. It's about being made at one with God, reconciled, restored, and released from guilt. As Keller puts it, the old system couldn't make you clean, it could only make you temporarily presentable. It's Jesus that makes you clean. And so I finished with the passage from John that we heard. It's a very familiar one. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Jesus didn't come to add another layer of rules or rituals. He came to take our guilt, both subjective and objective, and replace it with grace, freedom, and peace. The question for us is, will we keep living in those shadows, weighed down by guilt, or will we step into the reality of what Jesus has done for us? The work is finished, the load is lifted. All that's left is for us to receive it. And so as I finish, you might like to take a moment to ask yourself, what guilt do I need to lay down today? How can I let Jesus carry it for me? You might want to sit with that thought as we prepare to sing.